Hello, everyone, and welcome to Brown Bag History, documenting historic times. Staff are monitoring our social media chats. You are welcome to ask questions at any time in the chat, and staff will archive and aggregate those for the Q&A at the end. We would also appreciate your feedback about the program. And so a link to a brief survey will be provided at the end of our program. A recording of this program will also be available at the Minnesota Historical Society Facebook page and YouTube channel shortly after this program ends. I want to start off with a land acknowledgement. I want to acknowledge that even though this is a virtual event, the Minnesota Historical Society is located on the traditional territory of many nations and on the ancestral lands of Dakota people who continue to call this region home. We pay our respects to the Indigenous ancestors of this place, both past and present. As we begin today's program, consider the legacies of Ojibwe, Dakota, and other Indigenous nations working to have their histories included in the national narrative. I'm going to introduce our panel, then dive into our conversation. We are curators, all three of us, and museum professionals looking at collections through a contemporary lens, as we are all experiencing a historic year. All three of us work at the Minnesota Historical Society. I am Hannah Novio Erickson. I'm the Associate Curator of 3D Objects. My primary role at MNHS is to research and identify gaps in representation of Minnesota's people and histories. Over the last 2 years, I've been working with local Black and Latinx leaders and organizations to build relationships cross-departmentally. I also provide access to the collections through culturally specific tours and advise on exhibits. With me today are Kate and Jen. Kate, you want to start? Oh, you're muted.
Way to start out our brown bag here. I'm Kate Huida. I'm the curator of manuscripts at the Minnesota Historical Society. And as curator, I seek to document, preserve, and provide access to materials created by individuals and organizations. So part of my job includes acquiring materials like diaries, letters, administrative records, usually unpublished materials for the Minnesota Historical Society collections.
Thanks, Kate. I'm Jennifer Hoopscher. I'm the curator of photography and moving images here at the Historical Society. So I work with donors in acquiring either single photographs, small collections, large collections, moving images, and also sound recordings too. But that would make my job title ridiculously long. So, so I just work to shape and then share the sound and visual collections with the community. I promote the collection by assisting with exhibit work, speaking about the collection, and assisting researchers in the Gale Family Library along with our awesome reference team. And I am also a member of the AASLH Standards and Ethics Committee.
Awesome. Let's dive right into our conversation. So trying to set the stage for what we're going to be talking about, let's just start with what is an MNHS curator? What does an MNHS curator do? People are most familiar with curators, at least from my experience, curators at art museums who often help with exhibits. How might a curator at MNHS differ from other organizations? What do we do?
Yeah, so there's definitely a lot of crossover between museums and what we do at MHS, but one of our major responsibilities is acquisition work. So acquiring materials that we can use we can make accessible in our library at the History Center, items and materials that we can put on display or exhibit in any of our sites, including the History Center, and materials that we can use for other sort of educational and programming needs. And so as part of this work, we're often working directly with the public. Our jobs are really public facing in that we're working with individuals and organizations to seek out these materials that we then collect. I think that perhaps something that's unique about curators at the Historical Society is that we really work best when we're working collaboratively throughout this acquisition process, right? So whether it's working directly with a collection donor to ensure that their materials don't end up in the trash can and end up hopefully at the History Center instead, but also building strong relationships with like booksellers and art dealers who can help point us towards potential acquisitions, and then also working with community members and other sort of key stakeholders, both at the Historical Society and out in our communities, to help us, identify again potential materials and areas of collecting that we could, delve into.
I'm glad you brought up collaboration, just because we collaborate internally so much too. So I mentioned the library earlier, and they're one of the groups that we collaborate with a lot in terms of gauging who's using our materials and how they're being used. And Kate and I each have a shift on the reference desk. So it's always fun when you're working and someone is going to use a collection that you helped bring in. I enjoy that. We work with our cataloging team to help share these stories that relate to the materials we acquire. Sometimes a donor will tell us something that isn't obvious just by looking at the materials. So we make sure to communicate to that team, like, hey, there's this story that accompanies these images or this manuscript collection to help spread the story to others. We look to DICE, which is our Department of Inclusion and Community Engagement, and our NAI team, that's Native American Initiatives, when we engage with the community, but also when we're examining our workflows and biases, when we're looking to improve those. And of course, coordinating with strategic communications for social media or targeted messaging. We'll be talking about those last two throughout the presentation because they play such a critical role in our current collecting initiatives.
So we've talked about acquisitions a little bit, which is it's a central role of our jobs here at MNHS as curators. So I want to dive into that a little bit. So what do curators at the Minnesota Historical Society look for in collections? What does that process look like?
It's a great question, and one that always really excites me personally. I love talking about this. Like Jen, you mentioned use, is a big component, and something that, we think about a lot because of, we're on that acquisition end, and that's a really exciting thing to think about, people activating the stories in our collections. But we have a pretty well-developed set of criteria that we think through every time something is offered to us, every time something kind of comes up in our as a potential acquisition. So, being at the Historical Society, we have to think about our overall mission as an institution. We're looking mostly at statewide materials, statewide stories, as opposed to, say, like a local county historical society, which has a slightly more narrow scope. So we think about how a potential acquisition would fit into the overall mission of the Minnesota Historical Society, but then also each of our own individual collecting goals as curators. So, Jen and I, we have a lot of similarities in sort of what we're looking to, but there's also going to be differences just because of like the format of the materials we're looking at. Along with that, we also, look at the materials being offered themselves. Are they an excellent example of a particular moment in history, or do they document someone's life really well? Are they exemplary in some way, right? And then, to just sort of narrow it down even more, we also look just at the technical aspects of the collection, things like condition or formats, if it's a digital file versus a paper file, if it's a large format or a small format, anything that might sort of hamper our ability to sort of preserve the integrity of the materials long-term and to provide that long-term access, we also consider as well.
So I like to think of our collections as like a really strong collection will hold a constellation of stories. So if one item can really bring people together from different experiences or identities, that's a super powerful tool in building empathy. So I'm going to bring up one of my favorites that I brought into the collection, which is a group of Boca Chica menus. So this is actually one of the first menus that Boca Chica created. It was founded in 1964. So Boca Chica has been around and has been a staple of West St. Paul for a long time. And as you can see from this menu, it's pretty simple. It's a pretty simple menu. It's showing the founders, this founding family of this organization, Mexican Americans in Minnesota. It tells a whole bunch of stories. But then if you go to a more recent menu, which is from the 90s here, you can see how dramatically it's shifted from different generations of family members who have run Boca Chica through the generations. So you can see that in this one, it's really honoring Mexican heritage, and also the offerings have more than doubled. But I think this tells a constellation of stories, like I was saying before, not only about like family entrepreneurship, but then also Mexican American experiences and pride right here in Minnesota. Jen, do you want to share one of your favorites?
Sure, I've actually got a couple, and thanks for making me hungry, Hannah. So the first donation I want to talk about is a recent donation, but it covers a time period quite a bit back. It tells the story of Fred J. Lowe. And it was donated a couple of years ago by some distant relatives of his. He was an acrobat, and you can see him there on the left in one of his costumes. So this material was actually from the late 1800s and early 1900s, but it's a great example of an effort to fill in a gap in our collection. We do have a lot of material from that period, but not as much for entertainers, and especially from the vaudeville circuit. It's hard to come by that material, and then to have one that tells such a compelling story. If this material had been offered shortly after the time the photographs were taken, it may not have been acquired by MHS. That might not have been something that they were looking to document at the time. But it's a fantastic donation because it was photographic and textiles. So in addition to these images of Mr. Lowe, we were able to get a costume that he wore as a child acrobat. And it's just great because it speaks to the time. This wasn't his full-time job. He also worked at a printing company because he just couldn't make it work. But because of that, he stayed local, and all the materials we have of him show him working in Minnesota. The next item I've got is very recent. We just acquired it this summer, and it's moving images from the Shiro's project. So this is a contemporary donation from RISE, which is Reviving the Islamic Sisterhood for Empowerment, a local organization in Minneapolis. And so it's contemporary in terms of the dates represented. Everything is from the last 5 years or more recent. And then the format, it's born digital. So I'm not working with film reels or VHS tapes. It's all files. And this collection grew from contacts that were made between their organization and ours. And this is just a fantastic example of DICE working with us and letting us know that there was an interest in having these stories documented here on behalf of the organization. It's an example of collecting stories that are similar to those that exist in the collection, in that we document women in business, education, government, healthcare, leaders in the communities. But in this instance, it's prominent Muslim women in the community who are highlighted. And when I was talking with the folks over at RISE, I was talking about how this might get used. And I specifically brought up History Day students who regularly come to the library, and they're looking for unique stories to share about Minnesotans, and having the opportunity to talk with people who are still here. And that got her really excited about potential use for that. And so that's exciting for me as a curator, to just have us both really looking forward to getting this donation going and how it can be shared. And I like this excuse me. I like this collection in particular because it's the type of collection that combats the public perception of history. I recently looked at a document that was put out by Frameworks, and they had worked with AASLH, and they're talking about challenges and opportunities with communicating about history. And there's just this strong perception that history is chronological events driven by the actors or the actions of key individuals, usually men. And this isn't documenting a major event that is hinging on the actions of a single person. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of stories, and it really shows how they are involved and help shape the community. And just, it's kind of a ripple effect that way. So I was really excited to bring this in. And I know when we were talking about it, all of us were really looking forward to sharing that and seeing what else is out there.
Jen, I'm glad you brought that up, because I feel like so often when I'm working with someone who has materials that I'm interested in, I'll hear, "Oh, you wouldn't possibly be interested in that," or you're not possibly interested in me. I haven't done anything, right? And so like a lot of, what we do is also combating that perception, right? That like ordinary people make history too. And, Hannah, I think the Boca Chica menus are a great example of that as well. Someone might not think that would be something that a historical society would be interested in, yet you look at the beautiful iconography on the front, and there's value there in more ways than one.
Kate, you did my job for me, because we're going to segue into more contemporary collecting practices. So we just talked about RISE, we talked about Boca Chica a little bit, which are both more contemporary collections. So let's keep talking about contemporary collecting then. So History is Now is an initiative that launched pretty recently this year. However, let's talk about it a little bit. Let's zoom out a little bit. So let's just talk about History is Now as an initiative. What is it? How is it different from typical collecting?
I'll speak to that, just because I've been involved with all of the History is Now collecting initiatives that we've launched. So the first one was in 2013, and I have to give a shout out to Lori Williamson, because I had just started in my role as a curator in late 2013. And it was just after the Marriage Equality Act had been acknowledged, and folks could have same-sex weddings and have those be acknowledged. She's like, "Oh, we should use this as a great way to get some more wedding photos for the collection," because we have a lot of wedding photos. And so she and I spitballed a lot of ideas back and forth, and this was kind of our first proactive initiative in this realm. We do other proactive work, but this was going to be promoted on social media as a way to gather things. So we looked at making it super targeted. We only wanted photographs from folks who had been married in that first month. So that was a way to kind of control the volume of how many donations we could potentially receive, because we didn't really know how this process was going to work. And so we had that timeline in place. And then we also had the call out 2 weeks, maybe 4. So again, really compact timeline there. And we got, I think, about 40 or 50 donations. And it involved a lot of one-on-one follow-up. I made separate donor agreements, like hand wrote stuff in for each one in order to get it. We wanted to stick with Born Digital if at all possible, just as a way to be able to share this more quickly. Our cataloging timeline can always be bumpy and unpredictable, but Born Digital helps a bit in that it doesn't require all the images being scanned. So we were able to complete everything from, I think, offering that initial donation to having it published and available for everyone to view through our collections, I think within 6 to 9 months, which was awesome. And we were really pleased with it. But then as we looked at subsequent History Is Now collecting initiatives, we rethought maybe doing the donor agreements a little bit more filled in ahead of time, rather than me having to handwrite in the specific donations. So we did a couple more. In 2016, we put out a call for folks who had documented Prince's life following his death in 2016. And initially, we were going to keep that to Minnesota, but we did get some donations from elsewhere, including in Europe. There was a couple who had photographed how they were remembering Prince there. So we broadened that out a bit. And then with the Women's March in 2017, we broadened it out further in that we didn't just look for photographs. We were also looking for tangible materials like signs. So working with our 3D unit to bring in protest signs or banners that might have been used, or other things that might have had a part or a role within these marches. And so yeah, broadening out from the photos, but really no other tie-ins after that. Very isolated projects. So then this year, when COVID hit, I remember us talking after we'd all been given the stay-at-home orders. We were on a Google Meet and just chatting, okay, what are we going to do? How are we going to document this? And we really did want to think about this a little bit more in what our objective was, because we did want to collect short term. A lot was happening so quickly, but we also wanted to look at the long term and documenting how this has been playing out weeks, months, years. We'll see. So this effort was a little bit different. We created a form rather than just putting out an announcement that, hey, we want your photos or we want your stuff. This time we really wanted stories. If they had an image or accompanying material, that was nice, but it wasn't necessary. The process was a little less structured in that we didn't have a timeline on it. This is still open, actually. People can still continue to contribute. It's more of a team effort this time. We worked with our digital archivist, Sarah Barsness, to help make sure that the form we used a Google form, to make sure that the information being submitted was being backed up regularly. Obviously, Google does some backups on their end, but we wanted to make sure internally we wouldn't be losing this information, and that it was parsed in a way that we could save it effectively long term. And Kate, Hannah, do you want to talk a little bit more about it?
The only thing that I would add is what you started to mention there, about our other team members. History is now it's a collecting initiative. It's to help us grow our collections, but it's really a team lift. Not only our archiving and cataloging staff, our reference librarians who help provide access to these materials, our strategic communications team that help us get the word out. It really is. It's not just us three here.
Yeah, and I think another part of creating this form was that we also included a question about how do you identify, and that was in partnership with our Department of Inclusion and Community Engagement, so that we can open up this opportunity for folks to self-identify and share that part of themselves in whatever format they want. And so we did get some pretty some really creative identities, and then but then also some folks had really strong ties to what they were experiencing in their story that they were writing, and their own racial ethnic identity as well. And so you might have seen on the screen, we shared the blog, and that is also another part of this collecting initiative that History Is Now has evolved to have a component of, is having this blog. So as we're collecting these stories, we're also sharing them publicly, so that people can read about how other folks are experiencing the pandemic, and how other folks are navigating our current public health crisis. So we've talked about History Is Now a little bit. What really triggers a History Is Now collecting initiative? So we've had different iterations, but one, is it appropriate to initiate a History Is Now collecting initiative, and how is it decided?
So it's usually in conjunction with some kind of event that has statewide impact, but also regional and national, whether it happened here and is going out, or whether it's something that a lot of folks across the board are experiencing together. And it usually builds on a well-represented subject area in our collection. So I mentioned the wedding photos, like we have a lot of wedding photos. This was a way to kind of branch out contemporary photos, because most of the ones that we have are several decades old. With Prince, obviously international music icon. And with the Women's March, that was a national event, but also we've got so many protests documented in our collection throughout history. So it made sense with COVID to do that. But then while we were documenting COVID, we were furloughed, and then George Floyd was murdered. And we were brought back fairly quickly after that. But we were asking ourselves so many questions about how to document this, because this was major, and but it was different. And so we wanted to be very intentional with any collecting that we did. We wanted to take proper time to plan, to consider how we were framing the collecting, contemplating how we reach out and whose voices are the ones that are being heard. And then also think about not only tying in how this all fits in contemporary times, but how will this impact users in the future, and how will they be using the material? So we were a lot slower with this. It was so valuable for us to step back and consider when is it appropriate to launch an initiative like this.
Yeah, I think the impulse to collect things and document and preserve. I feel like it's a very human impulse, and that, many of us, while we might not be museum curators, a lot of us have our own collections of like family heirlooms, right? Or personal mementos that we picked up through our days, or collections of records or books or music and that sort of thing. And so, a lot of what we do is just trying to channel that impulse so that what is saved can be activated by future generations, right? It can be used, it can be engaged with, it can spark curiosity and encourage conversation. That being said, our resources are just limited, like all cultural heritage organizations. And so the need to be selective and strategic is there. And Histories Now is just one of the tools in our toolbox, so to speak. We do Histories Now, but we also do larger kind of ongoing collecting, either sound and visual materials, unpublished materials, published materials like books and maps, government records, oral histories, art, three-dimensional objects, and so these are all different, methods for documenting history is now.
I wanna also ask a question. How do collections influence our understanding of history?
That's a good question.
It's a big question.
To be perfectly honest, like one of the things I really love about my job is I get to spend my days dreaming about the future, which might seem strange given I work in a history museum, but I feel like so much of what we do is really thinking about the future and being forward thinking. We collect what's happening. We collect around what's happening now, not just to document that it happened, but to, like I mentioned before, spark that curiosity and to encourage conversation among future Minnesotans who will engage with these materials today, 5 years from now, 20 years from now, 100 years from now. The Minnesota Historical Society has been around over 150 years. So what will people 150 years from now be interested in learning about, reading about?
I think also just with the events of this year and thinking about contemporary collecting and being more proactive versus reactive in how we acquire material really got the curators talking, and having more of a shared goal, an overarching goal that we all kind of work for. So we have spent a lot of time working on a collecting plan, and a lot of discussion amongst all of us ensued, but it really helped us set priorities. It helped us focus on subject areas that we want to collect, whether we're filling a gap or adding stories that have been historically or routinely overlooked, or even to ID emerging stories. And it also keeps us mindful of our existing collection strength, so we can continue to add new and compelling stories there. And then also it helped us take a hard look at areas in the collection that right now we don't need to grow. We've got a really solid base that doesn't need expanding at that time. And then all of this is just sent within the context of collecting at MNHS historically.
Yeah, I think that, the interesting thing about the work we've been doing lately and sort of developing plans is that it's allowed us to see how the collecting activities that curators engaged with 50 years from now, how that has impacted the stories that we are able to tell today, and what types of stories and whose story, right? And so that's something that I, try to think about as we're collecting now. It's like, what will, what what impact will my decisions have on the future for research and exhibits at the Historical Society? It's a huge responsibility, right? And I think that, I can safely speak for all of us that we all take very seriously. And it's not just, sort of at the individual curator level, but it requires that ongoing commitment from the Historical Society as a public institution, and also public trust, in us to do this work and to do it responsibly and ethically and sensitively.
And I think you bring up trust, Kate, and I think that is something that we as curators think a lot about. And I think in our conversations this year alone, we've had a lot of conversations really focused on relationships and building relationships, whether they are ones that have already started or ones that are new, but building relationships so that we can build out that trust. Yeah, so thank you for bringing that up very much. I think that's also kind of segues into the History is Now collecting initiative. The COVID-19 most recent one is really focused on documenting stories of COVID-19, but also it's a partnership with the Minnesota African American Heritage Museum and Gallery. So considering how Black and African American individuals in Minnesota and also just communities in Minnesota have experienced the pandemic in very different ways from other races and ethnicities in Minnesota. So I think that partnership was a really important one as we launched that collecting initiative. But I think we're gonna open it up for question and answer now. I think we've got a couple questions coming in, but please, this is my my little I want to encourage more questions, so send them our way. So Sue Brown asks, how has the murder of George Floyd changed the way you approach collecting?
Yeah, so I mean, I would say that, when we first started thinking about this, it was a challenge in multiple ways. I think, as this is our job, this is what we do, this is what we love. And so our initial impulse was just like, okay, let's go collect, right? And Jen and Hannah, you both talked about this, about not needing to step back and, trying to be responsive, but not predatory, and sensitive, but not absent, right? And striking that balance and making sure that the stories that we are collecting are the ones that we really want represented in the collections years from now.
I'd say for me, it's made me just really think about where things are coming from and to to slow down, because I got a lot of offers from folks. I didn't even put anything out, indicating that they had taken photos of some of the artwork on Lake Street or University Avenue, or they had taken photos of aftermath from protests and uprising. But a lot of these offers came from people who had come from elsewhere and were sort of swooping in. And it was certainly well-meaning, because we do collect a lot of materials that way. But it didn't sit right with me, because there's no story behind those materials necessarily. Or it's a story that we don't want to, it's not the right story to focus on. And so I ended up actually rejecting a lot of donation offers because of that. And that was newer for me. I just haven't been in that many situations so far where I've had to do that. And so glad that I'm taking slower steps, I think.
I think something that we as a curatorial team also have been doing is having a lot of conversations internally, but then also a lot of conversations externally about really starting some new relationships from the aspect of like, how can we be of service? Then how might we be able to collect or document your work? So also connecting folks, not only within our department, but also with other folks within the institution. Because MNHS, as we've already stated through this program, it's a pretty big organization. So we have a lot of really passionate, amazing people that we work with. So trying to connect folks internally as well.
Oh, Hannah, you're muted.
There we go. Harrison Deckard, how do you see information archiving fitting into furthering efforts to digitize Minnesota newspapers post-1922 to a searchable database? How has the role of becoming a digital archivist changed how MNHS collects and stores information? Ooh, this is a hefty question.
Good question. I think that, I mean, one of the things that I've noticed is, even just as early as a couple of years ago, we'd see collections that have some paper physical materials and some digital. There'd be both components. And now we just live in a world where even more so now, everything is digital, right? There's just less and less paper being printed. There's less photos being like physically developed. So that, has changed the way we think about our collections as well, and that how many times do you clean out your email inbox? Like you might save only those like very special physical letters, but the emails they might just pile up. So that we have different criteria that we use for selection. We have different ways of working with people to make sure that the materials that they are saving are valuable and have that historic value. And then, seeing how what we are collecting, how it fits in with more, with published materials. So a lot of what we are collecting is not available in books yet. It's not available in newspapers. We're filling in gaps in what's being, published elsewhere.
I can speak a little bit to that just because I think photography is one of those formats that everyone just automatically thinks to regarding like digital, because smartphone is also your camera. And that's how a lot of people are documenting things. And so I would say it hasn't necessarily changed in sort of subject matter that I document, but I will have more ongoing discussions with donors, say what format it's in, making sure that if they're sharing something with me, it's at a high resolution, so that there's flexibility on our end for use in the future. And then also working with our digital archivist to make sure that the formats are ones that would be easy to adapt or change if necessary. I think there's a lot in terms of storage concerns, and that you can't see them. But we've done a great job as far as making sure there's backups both on tape, in the cloud. Lots of copies keep stuff safe. So
And another interesting, conversation that I usually have with people is this perception that there might be limited physical space, but there's unlimited digital space, right? Which is not true. Anyone who has an iPhone like me and gets those messages, it's like you need to delete stuff every other week. Like there are limits to what to digital storage as well, and so that's part of something we think about.
Storage is always on our minds. Going back to acquisition criteria, it's a big one. Do we have any more questions? All right, Shelley, do you have suggestions for a small staff, small budget organization to capture the stories of people that we know we have a gap in from our community? Does anyone want to start with this?
Hannah, I think you've been really pivotal, and you've helped us connect with different organizations who could then help us connect with different people. And so I feel like I've been really thankful for you as a colleague, because you've been able to sort of shepherd those conversations and nurture those relationships. And so, even though we're a large museum, we have the same sort of challenges too in reaching out to the right people. So I think finding stakeholders that can connect you to the right people, or help shepherd those conversations along, that would be a piece of advice that I would have.
I think also, like, you've brought up relationships. I think starting relationships in whatever way makes sense is also, like, it doesn't need to be around collecting. It can be around just getting together with a colleague from a different institution that has a different community than yours, to talk about the hurdles that small organizations battle with, but also just to, I think it comes down to just building strong, sustainable relationships, and that means time. I think with I started in late 2018, and I have some relationships that I feel like we're just getting started on having some strong, like, important conversations, and it's been 2 years, and so it takes time. I think takes time and willingness to I don't know, confront your comfort, being uncomfortable, being vulnerable with other people too. I think vulnerability is a really important thing as a curator to really recognizing your own biases in your own collecting work. I could talk about it forever.
Just by the nature of what we do, it's not, the results are not often immediately noticeable, right? Because of all the relationship building we do. And so while it's hard to recognize gaps in our collections, like that, it's not fun to feel like you're not doing your job well, but it just takes time. And so, like, just be gentle with yourself too, and know that the groundwork you're laying now will matter. It might not have immediate results, but it will have results in the future.
I think that comes down to also, I think so often museums, and I might be making an overgeneralization, so please push back on me here, but I think so often museums like to talk about numbers, but I think a lot of what we do isn't numbers. A lot of what we do is really like stories and people. And so although you might want to say I brought in this many collections over the year, I think it really tells a more honest story of who we are as a collecting organization when we really talk about the actual stories and the partnerships and relationships that we've built, which are not always quantifiable in that way. Now I'm
Numbers of
getting
lives
philosophical.
changed.
What?
No, it's great. Numbers of lives changed, right? That's a harder thing to quantify.
Mm-hmm. All right. Do we have any more questions? All right. Rita, how are you navigating how to prioritize what items to collect for History of Now? Ooh. Who wants to start?
I can start a little. Because it's something I think all of us are working on it together. And there's people who aren't on this call or on this presentation right now who are also working on this. But we spend a lot of time talking as a group. And just so with History is Now, for instance, we've got the form. And so all of us have access to it. We can call stuff out, say, oh, this story really resonated with me. What do you guys think about it? After we made the option for folks to opt in to have their story also sent to the Minnesota African American Museum, Heritage Museum and Gallery, we started looking at those stories. I think kind of putting a spotlight on those, just because they'd be shared between both organizations, and it might be good to take a closer look at them. And so that kind of addresses that particular form. But then there's other things that we are doing too, sort of that relationship component, which Hannah can speak about forever, because she's been so awesome, I think, at helping coordinate, but also I know helping me do my job better, and following up with things that have come kind of sideways and through like 3 or 4 people, and getting back to the original donor and hearing those stories. So like Copal, we had gotten a donation of a poster that it's bilingual, and it had to do with promoting voter registration in Latinx communities. And so it came from a completely unrelated donor, but I followed the dots and got back to the person or the people at Copal who were instrumental in making that, and the story behind the poster and the impact that it's had just make it so much richer. So
Prioritization is like an ongoing challenge, I feel like, because the documentary universe is so rich, you know, when you're looking at what's happening now. And, you know, unfortunately, on a more practical level, part of prioritization is just trying to seek out those materials that are most at risk, either because of businesses closing or staff are departing, or, you know, just the condition of the materials is deteriorating and needs sort of immediate help. That's something that we also have to think about too, is going where we're most needed at the particular moment.
I think that brings me into talking a little bit about how important conservation and preservation is, and those partnerships that we have with our colleagues. So I'm gonna ask a question, but in the acquisition criteria that we talked about a little bit earlier, we talked about like the more technical aspects of collections, and in what ways have you all, and this can apply to digital collections, but also to like physical collections, in what ways have you engaged with our conservation staff as you're acquiring new items?
Yeah, this is just a real simple thing, but it happened this week, is that we acquired a small collection from a woman who ran for office in 1926. So like really early in history of women voting. And in that collection, there were campaign materials that had been rolled up, like posters that had been rolled, and the paper was brittle and starting to come apart. And while I look at it and go, oh man, that looks really rough, I bring it to our conservation department and they're like, okay, I can do so, you know, and so they have skills that I, like, really, they have skills that I don't. And so, you know, I really rely on them to tell me, like, you know, is this salvageable? What options do we have to make sure that, like, one, this doesn't get any more damage, but two, then we can also bring it out and use it in displays and show it to people, and it, you know, will stay whole.
Any stories from you, Jen?
I feel like I'm down there quite frequently, asking for help, whether it's using humidity to help unroll posters that or photographs that have been in tubes for a very long time, and they come out looking fantastic. Or photos that they might be on a board mount, the mount might be cracking, or the photos themselves might be cracking, and the lab just does a great job at mending and giving new life to these materials, again, so they can last longer, they can be put on display, and more eyes can see them. So I'm very thankful for the work that they
And
do.
give us recommendations so that we can, you know, pass those recommendations on, right? You know, I have people who are maybe perhaps not ready to donate or part with a particular item, but they want to know how to care for it in the meantime. And so I'm always going between departments and like, what advice would you have for someone in this situation? Or what, you know, what would you recommend?
Oh man, all right. So we've gotten through all of our questions for today, so we're going to start wrapping up now. But before we go, we want to encourage all those watching to consider sharing your stories of how the pandemic has impacted your lives. We've mentioned our History is Now collecting initiative around COVID-19, and so I believe that will be added into the chat. So please feel encouraged to share that among your networks, but also consider sharing your own stories through that form. A big thank you to the team behind the scenes who has been keeping us moving forward and getting all of those questions put together and doing all of the things. And thanks so much for this conversation. You, Jen and Kate, I'm so grateful to call you my wonderful colleagues. And thank you again to all those watching, and we're grateful that you joined us for this conversation. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.